The word of my testimony for which I was slain. Page 14. Having already searched the margin glossaries of their early copyists' work, hoping to find perversions and false beliefs that could be inserted into the body of text, and knowing the only thing they could find were references to the doctrine they had used to gain control of God's real church, marrying their greed with the kings of the earth and inserting what scholars have called the Johannine comma. For hundreds of years, books have been written about it. They delivered their texts to Germany, the first book ever printed in mass since the flood. To those who love money, I should add that the Bible still sells more than any other book and is all-time bestseller. It still has the power to save in spite of all the might hell could muster. The plan was lofty and seemed unattainable in their lifetimes, which was true. Christians kept springing up everywhere, and the Jews were still scattered all over the world. It became clear that all Jews needed to be gathered in one location. Christians likewise would need to be collected before being dispatched of. The solution of the Jews was easy: give back their homeland. So in order to conceal their intentions, they played the long con. As their version of Scripture would soon be in the hands of many, an agent from amongst them named Martin Luther, a priest of German descent, made much pomp and circumstance about his grievances with the church. But his purpose was not to expose and put an end to its evil existence. He would not renounce the institution of saint worship, a tactic that had served their apostasy, capturing the people's minds and ensuring they rarely, if ever, prayed to God or even worshipped him. So Luther and a cohort inside the Church of Apostasy began a debate through writing letters. But the letters were not delivered to themselves, but were sent to the printers and were published as widely as possible within the apostates' realm. Using the new platform to control people's gaze of Scripture and conversations. As expected, people chose a side, which would often lead to arguing and fighting amongst them, not realizing that they were being played. To this day, their deception is revered as truth, and Luther presented as a hero of the faith. Even though they had a large audience, as expected, groups of people who truly received the gospel began cropping up. Enacting the next phase of their plan, the Roman Catholic apostates set out to murder and brutalize as many new believers as they could, making accusations of heresy or witchcraft. They shed much blood. In the meantime, it was made known one group of believers had fled to the New World and escaped persecution of the Roman Catholics. It worked like a charm, one of their expressions. They had driven much of Christianity to the New World, a portion of the planet that wasn't really new to them and had been deemed uninhabitable due to, among other things, the fact it was, still is, the largest caldera on the face of the planet. It was, still is, active, and it is only a matter of time before most of the continent blows sky high. Understanding that their heavy-handed approach could wind up making the people flock to the new version of Christianity before they had full influence and control of its narratives, adopting a new lighter hand of oppression, they themselves staged a war between themselves as Catholics and Protestants that was to never end until their goal had been reached. The deception seemed to be somewhat effective in turning men away from God. They began to notice the criticisms of common men shift from grumblings about the church to more specifically grumblings about Christianity and about people who are Christians. They needed to establish themselves the authoritative voice of their Reformation, their new false church. This was easily accomplished by building schools they called theological seminaries and told everyone their voice was authoritative. Simple. Pleased with the results from the Catholic-Protestant War, they began creating a fractured, incohesive view of Christianity by manufacturing new schisms. They would ask somebody interested in the things of God if their view of Christianity was Calvinist or Arminian. If a person took the bait, they would gleefully explain the differences and contradictions of each, knowing that convincing their victim to claim either as their belief was a victory for them, ultimately getting the people themselves to perpetrate their deception. They invented new denominations and taught their victims to speak ill of other denominations regarding practices of lesser doctrinal importance, such as communion or baptisms. Deviating from the truth and causing contradictions, however, they would all agree on the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, a doctrine that was confusing to everyone. Even honest people with good intentions could not adequately explain it. By this time, the industrial age was in full swing. Explorers had reached the southernmost portion of the globe and found what remained of the civilization that God destroyed in the days of Noah. They discovered that the evil man that brought God's wrath upon the face of the earth, cleansing it of their creations, had achieved a much higher level of technology than their present abilities. Most notable were in the scientific fields of study they called physics and also genetics. That is where they also found the demonic host that had been banished from God's presence. Being filled with a new zeal, they could finally envision the fulfillment of their plan to murder God's true followers. Perfecting their skill in deception, they began focusing on individual Christian men, aiming to destroy their lives or discredit them. They would use the tactic taught to them by Balaam the Jewish prophet, tempting them with sex, money, power, or any other thing that would anger God or lead them away from Him. Even those who had received God's truth had a fallen nature, and many fell. As they began having success eliminating a legacy of true belief in many family lines, the dwindling number of Christians was finally noticeable to them. They devised incentives for their own to enter the church and conceal their systematic attack on good men. Giving the appearance of a thriving church, they began to outnumber the redeemed. They worked tirelessly and developed lists of names and closely monitored them to target those doing God's work effectively first, while piling judgment on the rest to make them feel unworthy to work for God's purposes. Just as in the days of Noah, they began giving their daughters to the demons that new Nephilim now walked among the people. At this present time, there are Nephilim who are CEOs of many big corporations, hold political offices and positions of authority.